Before we begin, this episode contains discussions of rape and assault. Last time, on 17 Years, the Andrew Malkinson story.
We have no doubt that the new evidence shows these convictions to be unsafe.
And all that time, the real perpetrator, the real dangerous person was free.
Last year, Greater Manchester Police arrested a man on suspicion of rape for the same crime Andy was convicted of. Do you blame Greater Manchester Police for what happened to you?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. They're to blame.
I'm outside Manchester Crown Court, and it's finally stopped raining. And the most extraordinary thing has just happened.
That's Emily Dugan, the Sunday Times' special correspondent.
Where finally the right man has been found guilty of the crime that Andrew Malkinson spent 17 years in prison for.
That man is 52-year-old Paul Quinn. A former landscape fencer, Quinn is stockily built with stubble on his face and dark hair, balding a touch at the back. He spent the trial dressed in jeans, a white polo shirt and a black jumper, occasionally switching between his two pairs of glasses to read what was in front of him.
And it was a really emotional moment in the courtroom, just as they announced that guilty verdict. Sitting right in front of me were a row of the police officers who'd been working on the case. I could see they were shaking with emotion. And then to my right, in the dock, was Paul Quinn, the man who's just been convicted.
Emily's been in court following the trial for the last month and a half. The jury has been deliberating since the start of this week.
As the verdict was delivered, he took off his glasses and put his head in his hands, and then his shoulders were slumped. For the whole trial, really, he's been inscrutable. He's just been staring straight ahead, and it's probably the strongest sign of emotion he's given. I definitely found it hard not to cry, and I think that's because after more than 5 years working on this, I know how much it means to so many people. I texted Andy just after it came in, and he said, yes, finally, wonderful news, more relief than anything else. And now he's going to be asking serious questions about how he ever ended up in that position. And he's been asking these questions for years, but finally there is justice. And it's the most extraordinary, overwhelming feeling to know that finally, the right man has been brought to justice for this crime.
We've been following Andy's case in this podcast series since 2021. This moment signals the end of this chapter in Andrew Malkinson's long fight to prove his innocence, with Andy's conviction overturned in 2023 and now another man facing life in prison for the crime. But where did the story begin? In 2003, a mother of two was raped in the early hours of the 19th of July on a hot summer's morning. She was dragged down a motorway embankment in Greater Manchester on her way home. The woman, who was in her 30s, was attacked by a stranger. Andrew Malkinson, originally from Grimsby, was arrested, and in early 2004 he was sent to prison for life. He always denied having anything to do with it. Years later, in 2023, while out on licence, his conviction was quashed. You're listening to 17 Years, the Andrew Malkinson story, a podcast from The Times and The Sunday Times. I'm Will Rowe, the producer of the series. It's about how one man spent almost 2 decades in jail for a crime he didn't commit. Today, we'll hear how another man who lived near where the attack took place has been convicted of the rape. The same rape and crime that led to one of the biggest miscarriages of justice in modern British legal history, and cost Andrew Malkinson years of freedom. This is part 9, The Real Perpetrator. So Emily, welcome back. the last 2 episodes of this series we did without you. That's because you went and worked for another newspaper, but you've continued to follow this story. And I guess let's go right back to, when did you first look into the Andrew Malkinson case? And just a little reminder at this point, what exactly was that story?
So back in November 2020, I wrote to Andy in prison, and I'd heard about the case through talking to he had a relatively new legal team at the charity appeal. I was talking to them about various cases, and they mentioned his, and it sounded quite remarkable. So I wrote to Andy with a whole series of questions. Everything that had been written at the time of the trial painted him as this total monster. But it was really clear that there were some inconsistencies already. And so I wrote this letter, and he replied from prison with this incredibly densely written 13-page handwritten letter. And what kind of jumped out of the page was this very thoughtful man. And the detail he gave really did make me stop and think.
Andy Malkinson comes out of jail in late 2020, and it's at that point that you really take an interest in that story, and then we ultimately make a podcast series together.
We obviously raked over the case. We went back and forward over the different witnesses and the evidence and the lack of evidence that there was. But it wasn't until July 2023 that Andy actually had his conviction overturned. So he had to spend another 2.5 years living as a convicted sex offender out in society.
So when our series originally came out in October 2021, you said, as the reporter on the series, I believe Andy Malkinson's conviction to be unsafe. Then you actually left the Sunday Times, and as series producer, I had to kind of take over. And obviously I was at that point extremely invested in the series. And I was actually at the Court of Appeal when his conviction was quashed. And obviously I saw you there, but at this point you're on a rival paper. But it's wonderful to have you back. And you've continued to keep following, digging on the story. And you caught up with Andy quite recently, didn't you?
We reported, but I think we're on the highest point on the south coast.
Oh, it's glorious. Yeah, so we met up in Bridport, which is where he still spends a lot of his time. That's where Emily Bolton, his lawyer, is from. He took me on a walk with his dog Basil.
All right, Baz.
I got one. Here you go.
And Emily, his lawyer, came along too.
You go scan it and I'll ask Andy what he Yeah, there you go. There you go. That's it.
And we just, you could see how much he relaxed being in a kind of an open space in the woods.
Yeah.
3 bags.
Yeah.
He talked a lot about the impact of all this on him. He hates confined spaces. I think the sort of psychological impact of that time in prison has been significant.
All these things that you've already managed to change. I mean...
Yeah. I haven't finished. I want to change a lot more.
And what's top?
He struggles to concentrate. He gets angry much more than he used to.
And had your life
Yeah.
as it was in limbo for the 2 years
And this is
before
part of my fury. I still feel that very powerfully.
I mean, in some ways, he looks healthier. He's been on quite a health kick lately.
I've got my
these
Air Max.
nice.
Yeah, they're so comfy.
Yeah.
Yeah, they are.
Cloud walk.
Because I do all
Trying his best to manage his health, because of course it deteriorated terribly in prison. He contracted diabetes when he was in prison. But actually, whenever we got back onto the topic of this case, or Greater Manchester Police, or the miscarriage of justice watchdog, or any of these bodies that have been involved in his case, the anger was really raw, much more so than it had been.
And this week, it's been quite a momentous week because we now know who the true rapist was for that crime that Andy spent all those years in jail for. It's a man called Paul Quinn. But just for listeners of the series, can you just do a real short recap of the very violent rape that Andy did spend 17.5 years in jail for?
Yeah, so back in July 2003, a woman in her 30s was just walking back through Little Holton in Greater Manchester, early hours of the morning, and she was attacked by a stranger who we now know to be Paul Quinn, dragged down a motorway embankment and raped and strangled till she became unconscious. Obviously, clearly, there's no version of rape that isn't violent, but that this attack had particular brutality to it. I mean, one of the injuries she suffered was a partially severed nipple. When we saw the images in court of the state of her face after this attack, There was a sort of real sense of shock in the room.
So Andy Malkinson spends 17 and a half years in jail for that attack. It was a wrongful conviction, and we now know that the man that did commit the crime that night is a man called Paul Quinn. So who is Paul Quinn?
Back in 2003, Paul Quinn was 29, working as a fencer and landscape gardener. He was married, he had 2 children at the time. He was someone who, he liked to go on lots of nights out. He described this party lifestyle, basically, where he would go out clubbing in a club called Chuffers up the road from Little Holton, and he was local to the area.
How does Paul Quinn come on the police radar?
So we'd always known all along that there was DNA that matched another unknown male on the victim's vest top. And that was a really key area because the victim suffered what was a bite during that attack.
Yeah.
The initial forensic testing at the time, back in 2003 when the investigation was happening, just weren't sensitive enough to pull off a full profile. But then while Andy's case was being reinvestigated, a whole load of retesting happened. Paul Quinn's DNA was taken in 2012. And the reason it was taken is he was part of this big nationwide push to make sure that anyone who had committed a sexual offence that was quite historic did actually have their DNA added to the database. And the crime that he had originally been convicted of was a sexual offence when he was a teenager, so many, many years earlier. And so in 2012, the police knock at his door and he gives them a sample and thinks no more about it at that point.
So back in 2004, when Andrew was on trial for this rape, we knew that none of his DNA was ever on the victim, but he was essentially put in jail on circumstantial and witness testimony.
That's it, yeah.
We've already reported this in the podcast series. We know that a man was arrested in December in 2022 in Exeter. That was Paul Quinn. What happens at that point?
Okay, so this is your interview. In English law, you do not have to speak to us if you don't want to.
Yep.
You can remain silent throughout. I won't think you're rude or anything like that.
He's interviewed by the police. He denies everything.
You've been arrested today at your home address at 4 o'clock, okay,
Yeah.
for on suspicion of rape.
Yeah.
That rape, okay, you've had details off your solicitor. It's going back to 19th of July 2003 in the Little Holton area. Okay, do you want to tell me anything in relation to what you're aware of so far in relation to your involvement in that case, if any?
Of the rape, there is no involvement of me in that.
Okay.
He launches this astonishing defence about how he was sleeping with so many women and he couldn't possibly know how his DNA got there.
So when you say you'd go to house parties, who
Yeah.
would you go to these house parties with?
Whoever we went out with, whoever we met while we was out, we was very sociable.
Who was?
My brothers, my friends.
Okay.
He said that every weekend he and his friends and his brother go out clubbing and get with girls.
We always ended up in parties. We always ended up copping off with girls. We was at that age. I know, yeah, I did. I admit I've cheated on my wife hundreds of times with girls that we've met on nights out.
He said he even slept with girls who he met while working on fencing jobs.
I used to do landscape fencing. So we'd be refurbing housing estates, putting new fences up on housing estates, working on local schools, working on industrial places near housing estates, and we used to always meet girls. Always meet girls.
You've got this man who looks almost loose in the way he's sitting there. He had his arm draped over the back of the chair. He had his legs kind of diagonally out. He was only half sitting on his chair as he chatted to the officers, as if he was regaling them in the pub about his sexual conquests.
We go back to their houses. We go back to strangers' houses where we could be right to house parties. Or it'd just be kisses and canoodles on the street corners, in taxi ranks, even in the club. I slept with a girl in the club.
Even when he was told, frankly, distressing details about the attack, like the bite to the nipple, and he's not even reacting to it.
So is there anything you want to say in relation to that incident, how I've just described it?
No. I'd not made that real. No.
And the first time you see Paul Quinn is actually before he comes to trial in Manchester Crown Court. It's in the Magistrates' Court. Can you just talk us through what happened there?
He looked very confident, cocky almost, and he was sitting in this relatively small courtroom, and I was facing directly opposite him. You know, he wasn't in a kind of glass dock or anything like that. He was just looking directly ahead, and I was initially the only female reporter there, sitting in the front row, and it was so directly opposite him that eye contact was unavoidable. It was very unnerving seeing him in the flesh for the first time, this person who I'd been wondering who he was for several years.
And we come to Manchester Crown Court. He goes on trial. It's in early March. Monday the 2nd of March is the official date of when the trial of Paul Quinn begins. What exactly was he accused of?
2 counts of rape, as well as attempting to strangle and assault intending to cause grievous bodily harm.
You arrive at Manchester Crown Court on the first day of the trial. What was that like?
Well, actually, the first day of the trial is always a bit of an anticlimax because you see Paul Quinn in the dock for the first time, and obviously hadn't seen him since Magistrates' Court, and he looked very different. You know, he was this much diminished man, you know, very pale. He didn't have that kind of poise about him that he'd had. But no, at the very beginning of the case, it's actually a lot of legal arguments and back and forth, and the trial proper really begins once the jury is sworn in. It's a slightly odd courtroom, actually. It's got this enormous glass dock, which was designed for those kind of multi-hander gang trials where you might have 8 defendants all sitting in a row. But here's Paul Quinn, this aging man in his polo neck, rattling around this row of seats in this kind of fishbowl in the middle of it all.
What do we now know that happened on the early hours of the 19th of July in 2003?
Because it was 23 years ago, even the witnesses who came to describe what Paul Quinn's life was like at that point, and even what Paul Quinn said he was typically doing on a Saturday night at that point, you know, we can't be exactly certain of how the night started. But based on what he said, it seems very likely that he was at a club called Chuffers in Farnworth, and that he'd had a boozy night, probably taken quite a lot of drugs too, based on what he was saying about his typical nights out. At some point, he starts walking home and then dragged this poor woman down a motorway embankment and attacked her in the most horrific way.
And if you look on a map, you've got Farnworth and this club Chuffers, and the quickest and easiest way back to Little Hulton is over the motorway bridge on Clegg's Lane, and that's where the rape took place, isn't it?
Exactly. It's one of the striking things that the police must have thought as soon as they worked out that it was Paul Quinn's DNA. They must have looked up his address and thought instantly, it's the logical route back from the nights out he was typically taking.
As I understand it, she'd flagged a few people down to try and help her. She's stumbling around at just after 4:35 in the morning after the attack. Is that right?
She'd actually been trying to get help from other people. There was a really sad description of her essentially, you know, kind of clutching her face, bleeding, her eyes not even properly opening because they were so punched in. And she's trying to flag anyone down to help her, and the cars are just driving by. And then this man, he was just out walking his dog. He asks her if she's okay, and she starts telling him what's happened, and he takes her back to his house to help her. You know, when you write about this stuff, it ends up being sanitized, partly because there's a limit to what people want to read about. But it was really shocking to see in the court the state of her face, for example. You know, she was terribly injured by this attack.
So in this trial of Paul Quinn, the victim testified. It was 22 years on from when she first gave evidence in the trial in which Andy Malkinson was wrongly convicted. What was it like when she came into the courtroom?
I mean, it was really striking how vulnerable she looked as she came in. You know, she was holding the hand of a support worker. She was having to wipe away tears a lot of the time through her testimony. She has endured so much. I think seeing her walk in and seeing the damage that all this has done to her was pretty upsetting, actually.
And this is the first time that you'd ever actually seen the victim?
Yeah. So in this country, we don't ever report who the victim of a sexual assault is. They have lifelong anonymity. So unless they decide to waive it, you'll never know who that person is. And the day she walked into court, yeah, that was the first time I'd ever actually seen her.
What does she say when she testifies?
Initially, a lot of the questioning was about her memories of the aftermath of the attack and other issues that were really ultimately to do with the preserving of the forensics. And then suddenly there was this bombshell moment where she's asked about whether she had ever expressed any doubts that it might not be Andy.
Right, because in the original trial, she said she was more than 100% sure it was Malkinson in the courtroom.
Everybody, I think, was expecting her to say, when she was asked, did you ever have any doubts before the DNA? I think everyone just assumed she would say no. She didn't. She said, no, actually. When I was in court, I said I'd looked at him and I really wasn't sure it was him.
Wow. So now, in 2026, she was saying I wasn't actually sure at the time.
And not only that, but her description of it was quite astonishing, because she was saying that she was saying it was that the police had offered her reassurance.
Right.
And had said, don't worry, there'll be other evidence in this case. It won't all be on you. That was the kind of, in summary, what she was saying. And then she was asked in a bit more detail, and she said somebody more senior somebody higher, I think, than a policeman was the phrase she used. And so somebody, at least one person, if not more, connected to that prosecution, knew that she had real doubts on seeing Andy in court that he was the man who'd attacked her.
What was Quinn's reaction as he sat in the dock and she gave her testimony?
I didn't once see him look at her. It was almost like he was a statue, sitting there in the middle of this glass goldfish bowl, just expressionless.
And how far apart, roughly, are they, in physical terms here?
A handful of meters. It's not far. But the entire time he just stared ahead. The jury were looking at him and looking at her, and I'm sure they were, just as I was, looking to see if at any point he really looked, but nothing.
Never did?
No. I'm back outside Manchester Crown Court, getting ready for another day. And as I was walking here, I was just thinking to myself how completely horrific yesterday must have been for the woman at the heart of all this. It's really difficult because she honestly tried to tell her doubts in that trial. She tried to tell people about them, and everything just carried on. But I imagine she must have these twin horrific feelings of having to give evidence about the most horrific thing I imagine that's ever happened in her life. At the same time, as also having to defend the fact that she said in court she was certain. And, in another world, you could see somebody being, under other circumstances, pursued for misleading the court. But actually, my overwhelming feeling about her was how vulnerable she was and how much she was relying on the police and the prosecutors and the people around her to give her that guidance and reassurance. Nobody stopped at that point and thought, okay, she's looking at this man and she doesn't think it's him. It's pretty extraordinary.
A few days later, Paul Quinn's ex-wife gave testimony, and this was a big moment because obviously they're living together at the time of this crime. Catherine Quinn.
When we first heard that a man had been arrested for this crime and that there was a match to the DNA, I think everyone assumed that this would be essentially a one-fact court case. It's a one-issue case.
The one issue being DNA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To give the police credit here, they did manage to get some fairly significant witnesses and some extra detail that I think ultimately, especially when you see how the defence cast doubt on the handling of the forensics, I think ultimately this additional work did secure the conviction. And one of those witnesses was Paul Quinn's ex-wife.
So she comes into court. Talk me through that, because that was a key moment in the trial.
Yeah, and unlike the victim, she did give evidence behind a curtain. And I think it's interesting, and so did an old friend of his perhaps they were frightened of him making eye contact or just frightened of how it might go. So she gave her testimony and she describes a particular night. She didn't remember the exact date, but she knew it was the weekend of the attack. It's a relatively small community. And something like that happening, of course it's big news because it was a stranger rape. It plays to people's very worst fears that it's not safe to walk home at night on your own.
But she says on the stand that she remembers that, in her words, Paul, her ex-husband, had gone out that night.
She recalled the next morning discovering that the shirt he'd worn out the night before, which she described as a pale whitish shirt with faint stripes on it, how the victim had described the shirt, she described looking for it that morning and discovering it wasn't there when she was doing the washing. And she was a housewife at the time with 2 children. She said she did the washing every day. The fact that she remembered the shirt was then connected to the item on the news. He got home late. She doesn't remember him getting home, but she does remember his shirt wasn't there.
And there was one point, Emily, you're obviously in court watching this, that the prosecutor actually says to her, when you heard about the incident, did you say anything to your then husband about his missing shirt? And she responded to that, didn't she?
She said, I hope they don't find it anywhere near there.
And there being where the rape happened?
Exactly.
Do you know, actually, was that shirt ever found?
No, the shirt was never found. But of course, the fact that you had testimony from the victim and that it was taken off during the attack, I believe, all of that meant this white shirt was quite crucial.
So the key real breakthrough in this case is obviously the DNA. What happens when it comes to trial with that, and what do the jury see, and what is Paul Quinn's explanation for how his DNA has ended up on the victim?
Yeah, so the key bit of DNA is an area on the top of the vest top where there was also a test that suggested it was coming from saliva from the attacker that matched Paul Quinn. And it was a 1 in a billion match. It was about as comprehensive as it could be. That was ultimately what will have made things very clear in the jury's minds, I think, which is that, there was no doubt this was a match to Paul Quinn. And before that, this had always been seen as a key bit of evidence. Certainly by Andy's legal team, they were thinking, well, there is an unknown male here, and that had been known for a really long time.
And they discounted Andy because it's not Andy's DNA, and they also discounted her boyfriend at the time.
That's right, because obviously there are innocent reasons why, her boyfriend's DNA would be there, and so you have to discount anyone. I imagine they would have also potentially discounted other people who she saw that night. But here we have a direct match to Paul Quinn.
And he tries to explain this away in his police interview.
So it's quite telling that the first part of his police interview, he is talking about all his wild nights out and his hundreds and hundreds of conquests in the Greater Manchester area.
You would go out most weekends, drink, take drugs, sleep with, on average, say two girls a week.
Say at least 1 or 2 every weekend,
right,
yeah.
So that's 8 a month, okay? That's 96 a year over a 16-year period. You never used contraception once?
I've never used a condom once.
Okay.
And then when it transpires as the interview goes on, oh, actually this DNA was found on the vest top, he does suddenly change tack and he starts saying more broadly, it could have got there anyway.
So, how has your DNA, which is 1 in 1 billion, ended up on her top?
I really don't know. Because I did not do this offence. There's got to be some explanation I can't think of.
You've tried to explain away the DNA by making out as if you slept with the majority of Manchester over a 16-year period.
Okay.
And on the off chance that you can say that your DNA has been left inside a victim because you may have had sex with her at some time. Okay.
Yeah, but I've not said I've not had sex with them all. There's been contact.
Okay. So you're saying your DNA could have been left from contact with her?
It could have been from contact with her. But my DNA actually on it, or just on a clothes.
I've just explained to you where the DNA was.
Yeah, on the clothes, or actually on the
On
skin.
the vest top where it's been bitten.
So on the clothes.
On a vest top. So a vest top.
Saliva could have got on her clothes if I'd met her a couple of weeks before. If I could have even met her that night. I don't know. Saliva could easily have passed over, so I'm not bitter, I'm not raped, so.
So actually it's quite a clever bit of police work by not telling him exactly where this DNA is in a much different area, but obviously crime specific.
Exactly. But once he'd obviously said that in his police interview, that's what he's got to stick with as his defence. And it's a pretty unattractive defence.
And when Paul Quinn was in the witness box, he sort of tries to row back on this, doesn't he?
He was asked how he felt now looking back on that behaviour, and he said, disgrace to himself. And then again, how did he feel about having had unprotected sex with half of Manchester? Not how his defence phrased it, I should add, but certainly how he came across. He just said disgusted. But it was almost monosyllabic.
And when the prosecutor was cross-examining Paul Quinn, he basically said to him, well, Mr. Quinn, this is what you said in your police interview. You're now rowing back on that, but that's not what you really believe, is it? This isn't true remorse.
There's nothing particularly convincing about going into the witness box and expressing one or two words of contrition when you've conducted a police interview, lying back in your chair boasting about all your sexual conquests in Manchester.
There was one thing that I wasn't expecting that comes to light during the trial, and that's Paul Quinn's internet search history. How did this show his guilt?
Well, this is something the police were quite proud of, because I think what was really crucial about this is they seized his iPhone and there was nothing particularly incriminating on his iPhone. And then they get his Gmail account and suddenly they're able to see his browsing history going back a very long time. And what it shows is that long before he was ever arrested or ever had any inkling that he was a suspect, he was obsessed with this case. What's really interesting is that in September 2019, his phone history shows that he opened a Manchester Evening News report of the trial from 2004.
So that's Andrew's original trial for which he's wrongly convicted, and in 2019, Paul Quinn is looking at that.
And what possesses Paul Quinn in September 2019 to be reading an original report from Andy's trial? It's extraordinary. And of course, you've got to remember, this is before the flurry of media that has happened since, and obviously before the first article that I wrote in this case in December 2020, and before our podcast, before any of that, he is sitting there reading about that trial. And there was this really remarkable moment in court where the prosecutor said to Quinn, in 2019, there were two people who knew that Mr. Malkinson was a wrongful conviction. Him and you. And he said, is that the truth? And all Quinn could say was, no.
What happens in 2022? You published an article which also triggered Paul Quinn to suddenly become very interested in the case again in terms of his browsing history.
Yeah, and we don't know exactly what news articles he was reading at this time, although we do know that he started intensively going to the homepage of the Manchester Evening News. But in late July 2022, I broke the story that there was going to be a new forensic investigation opened in the case into Malkinson's conviction.
I.e. new DNA.
Exactly. And part of the headline of that case made the emphasis of DNA. And that report was then followed up by the Manchester Evening News the following day. And then 3 weeks later, suddenly, Quinn's internet history shows Google searches that are particularly incriminating. So he starts Googling stuff like, how long is DNA kept in the database? And then a week after that, why am I sweating so much all of a sudden?
And at trial, he just tries to explain this away as an interest in true crime and he doesn't really have an explanation for it.
No, I mean, his best explanation is inquisitiveness, an interest in true crime, and a concern about my health and my sweat.
Before this came to trial, before Paul Quinn was found guilty of this crime, Greater Manchester Police actually got in touch with you, didn't they, to ask to get you to help them a little bit with what was called Operation Canopy.
Basically what they had, at this point they'd obviously downloaded his whole Google history, having thought they'd drawn a blank on his iPhone. And what they wanted to be able to do was see, why does he suddenly start searching about DNA and about sweating? And also, why does he suddenly start going back over and over and over again to the Manchester Evening News homepage? And what they wanted to do was to find out when were key developments in the case reported and see if they could cross-reference that with what he's searching. You know, I sent them a kind of a full list of everything and the dates it went out. And then you could see it did correlate to this activity, that he was learning that there was a forensic development in the case and suddenly searching over and over again for not just how long your DNA is stored in the database, but can I say no if the police come asking for DNA? Extraordinary.
So they use that to show to the jury that suddenly this man that doesn't really have much interest in news and current affairs is suddenly reading everything about this case. And he doesn't really have a reason to, except maybe if he has some involvement in it.
Quite. And what was really striking about his police interview is that he's trying to claim he only remembers a little bit about the attack. He says it's something, oh yeah, I think I did, I knew about it because I think he mentioned having daughters and this kind of thing. But he didn't suggest he knew any great detail about it.
What do you think ultimately swayed the jury that Paul Quinn was the true rapist, was the real rapist?
I mean, clearly the DNA was that was the key fact that ultimately had put Paul Quinn in court in the first place, right? It was the DNA that got him there. But actually what we discovered as the trial went on is the DNA isn't the slam dunk for a conviction that you think it might be. It is possible, especially after 23 years, to cast considerable doubt over how it might have got there. And so I think it was all these other circumstantial details, the way that he conducted that police interview, his internet history, his ex-wife's testimony. I think that all combined with the DNA to suddenly make him look extremely guilty.
Today, on Friday the 17th of April 2026, just after 3:20 in the afternoon, Paul Quinn was found guilty of 2 counts of rape, as well as attempting to strangle and grievous bodily harm. That's 8,102 days after Andrew Malkinson was wrongfully convicted on the 10th of February in 2004. Quinn, who's 52, will now be remanded in custody until he's sentenced. He could face life imprisonment.
I think one of the really strange things about working on a miscarriage of justice case is that you often don't ever solve it. All you ever usually do is cast a lot of doubt. You think, goodness, how does this really pass the beyond reasonable doubt test? And you start gathering all the different pieces together. But it's actually really rare to get to the point where it's not just that you've decided the man is innocent, but that you then go on to see the police find and arrest the true culprit. And so it was quite astonishing every time I would look over at Quinn in the dock and just think, I don't know, it's something quite surreal that this is a man who's just been living his life for the last 23 years. He's just been, okay, take off a year of that when he's been on remand. But fundamentally, for 22 years then, let's say, he's just been able to live the life he wanted. He went on to have more children. He gave not a care about his wife during that time. He led a pretty obnoxious life in lots of ways. Quite beyond the crime. I mean, just to take that aside, he was not painted as a pleasant character. He didn't come across as a man who used that freedom to help society in any way.
So what did Paul Quinn do with that freedom? Did the 52-year-old just attack this one woman 23 years ago and then stop? Next time on 17 Years, the Andrew Malkinson story.
I think it's a distinct possibility that he has committed other rapes maybe of a similar nature to the one that was committed in July 2003 in Little Hulton.
And what now for Greater Manchester Police, who handled the original investigation, which left an innocent man in prison for almost 2 decades? We've discovered multiple officers are now facing gross misconduct charges, and one is under criminal investigation.
If these officers have misconducted themselves, then it will absolutely be dealt with through correct procedures.
You've been listening to 17 Years, the Andrew Malkinson Story, a series from The Times and The Sunday Times. This episode was hosted by me, series producer Will Rowe, with Emily Dugan, special correspondent at The Sunday Times. Additional production by Juliet Webster. This episode was sound designed by Tiffany DeMack, with original music by Tom Birchall. The executive producer on this episode was Dan Box. If you've been affected by any issues in this podcast, there are some helplines and websites you can access. Just go to the notes in the podcast description.